Welcome, everybody, to the California Apartment Association's first videocast. Over the next 15 or 20 minutes, we have some guests with us to discuss one of the biggest news stories as far as landlord-tenant issues in the East Bay in a long time, and that's the upcoming end to Alameda County's COVID-19 eviction moratorium. Our guests today are Rhovy Lyn Antonio, Senior Vice President of Local Public Affairs in an area that includes Alameda County, Joshua Howard, CAA's Executive Vice President of Local Public Affairs throughout the state, and Whitney Prout, one of our staff attorneys and Policy and Compliance Counsel. Rhovy, let's start with you. Is it an overstatement to say that the end of Alameda County's eviction moratorium is a long time coming?
Thanks, Mike. That's not an overstatement. And for the first time in 3 years, Alameda County housing providers can finally see the end of this eviction moratorium, and they can return to getting compensated for the housing services they have been providing county residents.
Sounds good. And Joshua, can we talk a little bit about the hardships that rental owners have suffered through this moratorium?
Well, I don't think we can overstate how restrictive the Alameda County eviction moratorium is. It is likely the most restrictive COVID-19 eviction moratorium in California. It allowed renters in Alameda to not be evicted for not paying rent. CAA did a survey of our members, and about 215 of our members responded to that survey, letting us know that they're still owed close to $70 million in unpaid rent. So there's still a huge debt to be paid to housing providers in Alameda County. But as Rhovy said, there's light at the end of the tunnel because this moratorium, the clock is ticking to end it come the end of April.
Now, you had a press conference that on, I think it was Monday. Tell us a little bit about how that press conference went and what the housing providers who spoke talked about.
At this event on Monday, we had several housing providers talk about their struggles. Judy Zhu, a immigrant to this country who was renting out a room in her home, was being denied rent payments from her renter. This is money she counts on to pay her bills, pay for her son's medical care. She and her husband had to take on DoorDash driving so they could continue to earn money just to make ends meet and provide for their family because they were not receiving the rental income they were entitled to receive. And it's stories like Judy's or stories like Hannah Kirk, another independent rental owner who was renting out a room in her home, and that resident stopped paying rent and for all intents and purposes made Hannah's life rather challenging. Hannah had to move out of her own home that she owned just because it was in such an untenable, stressful situation because of this eviction moratorium. And it's stories like Hannah and Judy that were never being uplifted or being heard. And that was what we were hoping to do on Monday. And thankfully, the Board of Supervisors on Tuesday didn't play games. They didn't pull any punches. They clearly just let the moratorium begin its rightful wind down, if you will.
And Mike, let me add to that the press conference was significant because it did tell the story of the victims of the eviction moratorium. You have to remember, when the eviction moratorium was put in place, it was put in place to help those who were impacted by COVID, those who had challenges to pay for rent because their jobs were impacted because of the shelter-in-place mandate, because of the shutdown. And so the eviction moratorium was meant to help that specific demographic. Because the moratorium was so poorly written and it was essentially flawed, it allowed for housing providers to be taken advantage of. It allowed for residents who maintained full-time work during COVID to purposely withhold rent. And these are the stories that were not being told, is those that were the victims of the eviction moratorium. And that's what the press conference and CAA's efforts highlighted before Tuesday.
So, Whitney, what changes come May 1st in Alameda County?
Yeah, so a lot changes, Mike. I mean, I would say the biggest thing for a lot of the folks that are probably watching this is that if they have a tenant who doesn't pay their rent come May 1st, the rental housing owners' hands are not completely tied as they have been for the last 3 years. So if a tenant doesn't pay their May rent, of course, the owner's still going to have to comply with AB 1482, proper noticing requirements, but that tenant could potentially face eviction for not paying that May rent. There are some important caveats. The barn door does not go completely open come May 1st. So the biggest caveat I would say is that for all this rent that has accumulated during this county moratorium, that's essentially still off limits for eviction purposes. So the county moratorium has a provision that says the tenant still has a defense to eviction even after the moratorium itself ends for all that rent that came due while the moratorium was in place.
Absolutely. And Joshua, let's go back to you for a moment. Since the presenters at the press conference, like Judy Zhu, Rubina Karnat, and Hannah Kirk, can't evict based on the back rent that's accumulated, tens of thousands of dollars, and in the case of Judy Zhu, I think $108,000 over the course of the moratorium. They can't evict because of that back rent. What options do they have now?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the eviction moratorium, as Whitney just said, does not allow a housing provider to evict for the rent that they're still owed that came due under the moratorium. Owners do have a right, and I'll let Whitney talk about this, to pursue that potentially in court. But what's also really important to recognize is that these owners who are owed rent, like in the case of Judy, who's owed 6 figures in unpaid rent, this is where it really becomes important for the Board of Supervisors. The Board of Supervisors really needs to recognize, and I believe they're starting that process, to recognize that housing providers are still owed millions of dollars. And the Board of Supervisors needs to look at the county and look at ways that they can make funding available to help those individual owners who have not been paid rent under the moratorium. So the California Apartment Association is calling on the Board of Supervisors to look at ways they can make, I'll call it rental assistance available to owners to pay for the back rent, look at ways to work with those owners to help them afford their property tax payments or to delay their property tax payments without penalty, and make the burden a little less on these individual owners who have been denied this money they've needed for so long, not just to take care of their families and take care of themselves, but also to invest in their properties, to maintain them, keep them up to date, and ensure they can continue to provide quality housing.
So, Whitney, what options do landlords who have all this rent debt that they haven't been able to collect, and they can't evict based on it? What are their options in terms of litigation?
Yeah, so I mean, ideally, as Joshua was saying, the county will make some funds available because ultimately these huge rental debts have accumulated because of the county's choice to say that tenants didn't have to pay their rent for all this time. But I also think it's important to note that tenants do still owe that money. So the fact that they can't be evicted does not mean they are completely off the hook. And so the main remedy that property owners have if they have tenants with these huge rental debts that have accumulated is to go to court over them. And that is not necessarily in an eviction case, as I was saying, but in a breach of contract case. So when tenants sign a rental agreement and say, I'm going to pay you this rent each month, and they don't pay it, property owners get a breach of contract claim that they could sue over, potentially in small claims court. Depending on the amounts and when they came due, that gets complicated. But in regular civil court, in a breach of contract action, and get a judgment for the amounts that they're owed. Collecting on those judgments can be tricky, but there are various tools that are available under the law to collect on those judgments, things like wage garnishments and other tools that are out there. So that would be the main legal remedy they have. The moratorium does say that tenants get a 1-year repayment period from when the rent came due to repay that amount. That's a rolling repayment period essentially each month. But after that 1-year time period has elapsed from when the rent came due, landlords would have the ability to sue the tenant in small claims court or regular civil court for breach of contract.
Well, we've talked a lot about what's happened in Alameda County and the eviction moratorium finally coming to an end at the end of April. But aren't there still cities in Alameda County that have their own moratoriums that have no end in sight?
That's right, Mike. I mean, the biggest example of that would be Oakland, right? The largest city in the county continues to have an extremely onerous eviction moratorium, very, very similar to what the county had in place for tenants who do not pay their rent or who are otherwise breaching their lease. And that continues on, at least as far as we know right now, from May 1 and forward until the city of Oakland either ends their local emergency or the city council takes steps to amend that eviction moratorium to bring it to an end.
Now, CAA has a lawsuit it filed against Alameda County challenging the constitutionality of the eviction moratorium. Where does that lawsuit go now that the county eviction moratorium is slated to expire?
The short answer is it goes forward. And so in some ways, the end of the moratorium means everything to the lawsuit. And in some ways, it means very little because, of course, a major reason that CAA and a number of the small property owners that we partnered with in filing that lawsuit pursued that lawsuit was to bring this moratorium to an end. And so the fact that that is now finally happening is huge relief to the property owners that are working with CAA and, of course, property owners across the county. But it's not the only reason we pursued that lawsuit. So as we've talked about, this moratorium has done a lot of harm to rental property owners in Alameda County, and the county needs to be accountable for that harm. And so that is another part of the reason we're pursuing this lawsuit. We're saying that, hey, not only does this moratorium get to end, but the county doesn't just get to wash its hands of it because it finally brought this bad policy to an end. So we are continuing to pursue that lawsuit. We have claims against the county for the damage that caused as a taking of private property rights, and saying that the property owners who have been harmed because they haven't been paid rent, but not only non-payment of rent, right? We have property owners who have had their properties damaged and they've not been able to remove those tenants causing that physical damage. We've had property owners who have tenants who are nuisances, who are engaging in fraudulent and criminal behavior, who have not been able to remove those tenants. And all of those things have caused harm to property owners. And so our lawsuit is saying that property owners should be compensated for those harms because it is ultimately the county that caused those by saying owners had no right to do anything about it.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct, because with the eviction moratorium being in place, it made it nearly impossible to evict anybody, even when there's a bad behaving tenant nearby. And a lot of the attorneys that we've talked to even said that Alameda County is a place that they're not going to accept any new clients because it's just impossible to get anybody evicted, even again for bad behaviors.
I think it's important too to recognize that there's a lot of fear mongering going on right now. At the Board of Supervisors hearing on February 28th, there was a lot of public testimony that the end of the moratorium would mean the tsunami of evictions and that rental property owners would begin evicting almost overnight. I think what's really important to hone in on is with the expiration of the moratorium, renters in California, renters in Alameda County have robust protections under the California Tenant Protection Act of 2019, otherwise known as AB 1482, statewide eviction protections, statewide protection against rent gouging. And it's very important that housing providers are well versed on the California Tenant Protection Act, which CAA on its website has robust materials, but it's also really important for renters to understand what their responsibilities, but more importantly, their rights under the California Tenant Protection Act include. They cannot be evicted unless they've committed a certain cause that's outlined in the California Tenant Protection Act. If an owner wants to move into their unit, they have to give a certain notice and pay relocation assistance. If an owner wants to take a unit off the market, they have to give a special notice and pay relocation assistance. There's also this concern that housing providers are going to evict tenants who bring up concerns about leaking toilets or unsafe living conditions. Let's make it clear. State law is very clear that tenants, renters are protected from any form of retaliation or harassment for raising those concerns with either their rental housing provider or a city or county building official or city or county enforcement official. So it's going to be very important that education become a critical tool of what goes forward to make sure that the fear mongering stops and that people understand what is in place, not just in Alameda County, but across California. And Rhovy, I think that's also part of what we've asked the Board of Supervisors to consider as they look at what's next as this moratorium winds down.
Absolutely. Before the vote on the eviction moratorium, President Miley put forward a plan on how to allocate resources and identify potentially new programs to help both renters and rental property owners after the eviction moratorium. And one of that included supported by CAA, is an increase in robust effort to educate rental property owners and renters on their rights, roles, and responsibilities. The roles is definitely an important one because they need to know that what a landlord can and cannot do. They cannot just enter a unit without any notice. That is a fear that has been spread among the community, but like Joshua said, state law covers that and protects renters from having that happen. And so the county needs to also put in a lot of resources in educating the renters on what their existing laws and protections entail.
Housing providers need to understand that just because we had this action on February 28th doesn't mean that our work is over.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a lot of work ahead of us as this moratorium ends. What are the next steps? What's coming next before the Board of Supervisors as it relates to the eviction moratorium winding down and those different resources that we talked about a minute ago?
I think the success of Tuesday was due to the fact that rental property owners mobilized and shared their stories. And that needs to happen even more. Just because we had a good result on Tuesday evening doesn't mean that our fight stops here. You have to remember that this was the county. The county has cities below it. And so some of these fights may happen in the local city, local jurisdictions, and it's up to the rental housing providers living in those cities to be vigilant that when they see a potential proposal or a legislation that would further regulate the rental housing industry, for them not only to watch what's happening, but to stay engaged. Staying engaged could easily mean attending the meeting, scheduling a coffee with that policymaker and explaining to them the pros and cons of this specific policy. A lot of rental property owners sometimes get this feeling that they need to have a hired professional help in order to get their story told. And that's not true. They can do that on their own. Ultimately, it's their voice and it's their story that makes the impact on these policymakers. And that is the one action item I wanted to leave our members, is to continue to stay engaged and to be vigilant by always knowing what's going on at City Hall.
If someone sees this video cast and says, you know, that's happened to me, I've suffered through this moratorium, I have a story like Judy's, what should they do? Would it still be productive to contact CAA and share those stories?
Absolutely. I think my first advice is say, do not be afraid, and that you're not alone. As you could tell in the press conference with other stories that were highlighted and the number of rental housing providers that were supporting these stories, they're also in the same boat. And so my advice is to continue being active.
At the Board of Supervisors meeting, the Community Development Department's housing director was talking about how she doesn't have a good handle on the number of housing providers who are impacted or what they're owed. So I think it's really important that housing providers do reach out to CAA. Let us know what the effect of this moratorium has been on you, because that's the only way we're going to be able to capture the data to make sure that the county is able to put the appropriate resources behind the response that is necessary and the funding that is required to help make housing providers whole.
One thing to also recognize is that a lot of the policymakers who spent hours studying the subject matter, listening to hundreds of hours of public comments, either at the county chambers or meeting with different groups, is that they really did work hard to come to this conclusion and to this decision. There are three in particular that we want to recognize who have allowed for the public discussion on the eviction moratorium and the hardships that rental property owners have endured. And that is President Nate Miley, Vice President David Howard, and Board of Supervisor from District 3, Lena Tam. All three have supported efforts to have this public discussion and have an open and transparent conversation with staff on the effects that a moratorium has had on rental housing providers.
So thank you all for shedding light on this Alameda County drama that's been unfolding for 3 years. Thanks, Whitney, Rhovy, and Joshua. And just a reminder to any of the viewers out there who want to keep tabs on this issue and others happening throughout California, visit our website, CAAnet.org, where we're constantly updating content with news stories and now this video cast and compliance materials. So be a frequent visitor of our website to stay in the know. Thanks, everybody.